those areas today. Because it really covered a lot of ground. So a few that I think could be relevant to your role with the CTSA. So one of those areas is around admissions, and I think is really still a very important area and an evolving area that's important for biomedical sciences and recruiting a diverse, talented workforce. There has been a lot of work on admissions in the health professions, much less so has there been attention to this in graduate schools up until probably the past, like maybe 5 to 7 years. What we do know is that GRE scores have traditionally been a gatekeeper metric for graduate schools, particularly in STEM and biomedical sciences. It's a quantitative measure that folks have felt, is neutral or fair. It makes the process more expedient. It's often been used historically as a way to screen out unqualified applicants and to winnow the pool down into something manageable. And a Council of Graduate School survey just in 2016, I believe, surveyed directors of PhD programs, and by and large, most people felt like, the emphasis on the GRE is about right, and only about 11% felt there was too much emphasis on the GRE. There's a lot we don't know about graduate school admissions. It varies dramatically from discipline to discipline, but also from various programs, and is fairly opaque. So the issue and the problem is that there's mounting evidence that the GRE scores, which were never really a validated measure in the first place, are really not well predictive of success. And so they're generally weakly correlated with first semester grades, but not with completion, not with publication rates. And there's been more and more analysis of institutional outcomes with regards to GREs at University of North Carolina, at Vanderbilt, at UCSF, which have reached a similar conclusion that GRE scores are not really well suited for how it's being used. There's also problems with the GREs. There's significant disparities in test performance by demographic group. And the figure on the right is from an article that was published in Nature in 2014 that caused a stir at the time, which shows, a significant disparity between different demographic groups. And the authors of this, who are physicists, noted that in the physical sciences, there's often a cutoff point of a minimum score of 700 required by many PhD programs and that's sort of indicated by that top bar. But if you look at that as a cutoff score, that would essentially, as a screening tool, eliminate the vast majority of women and students of color from even being considered in the evaluation. And since this was published, and there's been much more data out about the GRE, there's been much more scrutiny and a concern that the reliance on the GRE is essentially reproducing racialized outcomes. There's been a number of institutions now stopped using the GRE, in part because of the pandemic and other issues around sort of inequitable access and costs. We're also kind of highlighting some of the underlying concerns to begin with. So looking forward, I think there's a lot of work that can be done on graduate school admissions. And I would say that campuses that are committed to evidence-based practices around diversifying the biomedical research workforce should or would strongly consider eliminating the use of the GRE until there's better data to understand how it should be used, or at the very least, de-emphasizing its use so that it's not being used as a screening tool or early on in the process for evaluating applicants. I think there's a lot of work underway to adopt holistic review in graduate admissions, and that's a pretty extensive process. What it essentially, I'm probably assuming that UC Irvine is doing this, definitely in its medical school, probably in a lot of the graduate programs as well. But a holistic review process will be much more focused on the mission, including diversifying the workforce and the student body. And doing so would evaluate applicants through a variety of criteria and methods, rather than simply sort of putting disproportionate emphasis on GPA, standardized test scores, or in graduate school admissions, the former school of attendance is often another factor that's really highly prioritized. In the health professions, we think of this as looking at a balanced consideration of experience, attributes, and metrics. But what's really at the hallmark of it as well is systems and culture change, because there's needs to be really attention to who is doing the evaluation of candidates, the criteria and the sequence being considered, the structure of the review, so things like rubrics or approaches to interviews that mitigate bias. And as well, and this is the part that's probably the hardest part of culture change, is really the faculty mindsets with which you're assessing the information about applicants, which often sort of rely on sort of traditions, norms, anecdotes that can introduce bias into the process. I bring this up not necessarily because everyone's actively involved in the admissions for their departments, but there may be also principles for holistic review that could play a part in the training programs for your early career faculty or predoctoral students through the CTSA. I think there's also an opportunity, I mean, once you start getting into holistic review and into the criteria that are assessed in the admissions practices, it becomes also imperative to consider whether which students will have access to the types of experiences that will be valued in the selection process. So, and for the CTSA, that will really be access to high quality research experiences. And one of the findings of the group back in 2016, looking at admissions to graduate school, was how much the admissions process tends to rely on prioritizing candidates that come from certain research institutions that are research intensive, that are also predominantly white, and essentially favor students that have access to those high quality research experiences. And I think there was a partnership with UCI and HBCUs, but that's another potentially an institutional relationship that you already have that could be leveraged with the CTSA to increase the pipeline. So there's a couple of resources that have just been developed in the past really couple of years. There's the Alliance for Multi-Campus Inclusive Graduate Education. They produced a toolkit for graduate schools. The USC offers workshops on aspects of holistic review. Julie Passelt is the scholar that's really been leading a number of efforts around use of holistic review in STEM and biomedical fields. And then there's somebody at UNC is keeping a list of all the biomedical programs that have essentially been stopping the use of the GRE, which I think was maybe 70, 5 years ago, and is now probably 400 or 500 on that list currently. So that has been something that is evolving. Obviously, when you stop one thing, the question becomes, what do you replace it with? And that's where I think the sort of systemic change around gatekeeping into graduate school and who is selected as to be part of graduate school becomes an area of inquiry that I think could go hand in hand with the work that you're doing with the Black Thriving Initiative. So another area to highlight is around the inclusive climate. This is something you all certainly know, but I'll just highlight what the evidence says, that it's really important for achieving the benefits of diversity. You can get to representation, but if you don't have the climate that's inclusive, then you're not going to achieve a lot of the benefits. So an inclusive climate aids retention of minoritized students by increasing belonging and scientific identity, reducing incidents of racism and discrimination, and also fostering academic engagement and performance. There's evidence that improves the learning environment for all students when there is an environment that is inclusive. It's very important for making sure that you can both attract and retain diverse faculty. And then I think a recent survey of graduate students found that the majority of doctoral students felt that climate affected their ability to succeed, and about half of those students felt isolated. One of the conclusions from the group that did this report on climate before is that we really need better mechanisms for measuring climate to support action and accountability. There's these sort of one-off efforts to do a climate survey that get published, and it's hard to determine, what's my role as a department chair, what's my role as a faculty member in terms of taking action to improve the climate. So that's something that was highlighted. Another piece that was highlighted was just how important the top leadership visibility is on DEI issues for leading change. However, many leaders are unclear on their role about this, particularly with regards to making systemic change. So people will say, well, what exactly can I do? And if you're a department chair of a biomedical sciences, you might be an expert in a particular field. It doesn't mean you're an expert in leading racial equity. And so there really is a need for many more leaders to be both visible but skilled in helping to create the change that is aspired to in aspects of things like the Black Thriving Initiative or your CTSA work with that. A couple of things, one that we developed. So the diversity, inclusion, culture, and equity inventory was developed by our USU in partnership with the AAMC. It's actually piloted in California and University of California, Irvine, and Dr. Haynes was a PI for piloting that there. So he actually helped us develop this. It's different from a climate survey in the sense that it helps institutions take an inventory of their policies, their practices, their procedures, and programs that impact climate and culture. A couple of things to highlight is, again, just the importance of diverse leadership representation in your CTSA, in the departments. That is one of the things highlighted in the inventory. The quality of mentoring and the structures to promote community among underrepresented scholars is an area where I think you all could certainly make strides. Looking at the policies and practices, not just outside or in the community, I know that aspect is really important, but also the policies and practices and procedures that are within our own departments to the extent that we have influence on those. And then finally, rewarding faculty research and community engagement related to advancing racial equity or health equity, and sort of hardwiring that into some of your systems. I know you all, I believe that is already through diversity statements and other things like that, somewhat incorporated, but obviously people are looking for ways to make that more, to have greater accountability and rewards for that. There is Sean Harper's group at the USC, the Race and Equity Institute, has recently started equity institutes and these racial equity leadership academies to address the lack of really intensive curriculum and learning experiences for leaders who want to take an active role and need to take an active role in advancing racial equity. That's sort of, I think, acknowledging that some of the one-off trainings that have been happening may be, nice, but are not potentially a solution for the challenges that are really facing institutions and the types of work that needs to be done to make strides. I would also say that there's that Julie Pasalt's group, again, the Equity and Graduate Education Resources Center. I saw they offered a workshop on fostering well-being and racialized mentoring environments. So I think thinking about the research to student mentoring relationship is another area where the CTSA could potentially play a leading role. And I think we're getting to the end, but I'll just say that another area, because we're working on this area right now, that I think could be something to know about or look into, is the importance of belonging and having a growth mindset culture. This was one area highlighted in the report, and we're now working on this with a set of 6 universities now and about 300 faculty. But we have decades of social psychology research about the impact of the environment on how students experience and navigate through college and beyond. Most of the research has been in K through 12 and college, but there's now more in graduate school. We know that when students enter college and at transitional moments throughout their career, they're asking themselves important questions about whether they belong and if they can succeed. And the way they answer those questions are really in part determined by the environmental and interpersonal cues that signal from others if they belong and their potential for success. And that in turn links with how students face the challenges that arise, whether they even reach out for support, and ultimately affects retention and academic achievement. And an important part to highlight of this is that students from structurally disadvantaged groups come to campus already knowing that they'll face underrepresentation, that there's negative cultural stereotypes about their abilities and other barriers. So they're paying particular attention to signals from the institution, the professors, and other students as to whether they believe that they or people like them belong on campus and can succeed there. There's a lot of research to look at and a lot of resources, but I just wanted to highlight, we just released a first day toolkit that was developed with about 74 faculty. It's intended to help instructors and faculty create a growth mindset culture and foster belonging starting on the first day of class. It could also be potentially used in any kind of outreach programs or mentoring or other areas in which you're interacting with students. It includes a online module that faculty can sign up for, some practices for reviewing the syllabi, doing a review of equity review of the policies and practices around the classroom environment. And then there's another library which has more evidence-based practices for improving equity and student experiencing, ranging from student supports to even the physical environment. So those are a few resources you can check out. And I would say, just sort of ending this, is that, and this was attributed to Deming, which is around one of the leading thinkers on continuous improvement, is that your system is perfectly designed to give you the results you're getting. And I think that is a good quote to end with, because we are at, I think, a critical juncture in terms of thinking about what outcomes our system is getting. And instead of thinking of everything that we can do to increase diversity as an additional add-on program, rather thinking much more about what our system, how our system is designed, and how we can redesign the system to get the type of outcomes that we need and want with regards to having a diverse workforce in biomedical fields in the future. So that's all I have. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Jennifer. Really appreciate it. Any questions? Dara, do you have a question, or are you just applauding?
Well, I have a question if Dara does.
Dele, why don't you just introduce yourself so Jennifer knows who you are?
Yeah, thank you. I apologize. I came a little bit late. I came from another meeting that's trying to build digital inclusion into One Health education. So it's related. And I appreciate the depth of expertise that you bring to this topic. I've been involved in debates about the requirement for standardized tests for some time. And I am interested to know if there are now data about the outcome of not requiring GRE and other type of tests. I think the preliminary results from the pandemic is that some institutions are reversing the trend of eliminating GRE. I think MIT was the first to kind of announce that they are going back to GRE, in part because we didn't have a replacement. And so number of applicants skyrocketed and the admissions offices were not prepared to really make sense out of all the information they're getting. So it would help to talk also about what to do in such situations so that we don't create a new problem by trying to solve another one. Thank you.
Yeah, and I really appreciate that question. It's really apt for what is likely to happen. And I think what I can speak to from is the work done in the health professions, which has about a 10 to 15 year head start on this. And we actually had conducted a study with 228 health profession schools on the use of holistic review over a decade. In those professions, yes, the evidence was clear that it did lead to the increase in diversity, and it did not, at least the self-reported outcomes from the schools was that there was not any worse outcomes, which is what people would fear in terms of student achievement. And so that was, but what we also found is that people who thought they were using holistic review were using one or two practices. And there was a really big array of what people thought was holistic review. And what I think we found in working with schools on holistic review over the years is it's really, I honestly think it's a 5 to 7 year journey for schools, for leaders that are utterly committed to the process. And I do think that medical school admissions is easier, or health professions admissions is a little bit easier to, so I'll say that there's been a lot of work to help institutions undertake that journey, because it does involve a sort of a replacement of the old way of doing things, which was easy. And if you get thousands of applications and you don't have unlimited resources and time to review them, you need some way to sort of go through the process. So there's been a lot of resources that have been developed in medical schools. It's not easy, but I think there are the work has shown that it can be done. In graduate school, I can imagine it's going to take a while. And those institutions that don't have the long-term commitment to it or the wherewithal to embark on a process of culture change may decide to go back. So I think it'll be interesting and remains to be seen regarding what schools do and whether that was just a pandemic-related response or whether they continue to embark on the process. I'm not aware of any outcomes yet in graduate schools of not requiring the GRE, but that resource that I linked on that first of Julie Passalt's group, she's doing the work with a bunch of universities in California and with, I think she just got another grant from the Sloan Foundation looking at this. So I bet you she would have access to any studies on outcomes of alternatives.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. And I should not disobey Dan Cooper. I didn't introduce myself. I'm deeply appreciative. I direct the workforce program for ICTS and I'm a professor in public health. Thank you.
Joni, you've got your hand up.
Oh yeah, and I don't think I actually introduced myself either. So my name is Dr. Joni Rizzoti, and I direct the Bird Unit, which is the Biostatistics, Epidemiology, and Research Design Unit. And then I was part of the initial working group, and also the group Continue On that's leading the Black Thriving Initiative for the CTSA. Question for you. This is the conversation we've had here at our CTSA Hub for a while. And when I think about a lot of the initiatives that you put forward, I think those things have all come up in some of the spaces I've been in. But then part and parcel with that is similar to what Dele was saying, which is about a resource allocation, right? And I think we've all we discussed internally what that looks like. Does that work? Because like right now, that work kind of gets disseminated amongst existing staff, right? And researchers. Like in the universities that you have worked with, who have been really fully committed to this, what is the structure you have seen that has been successful with institutionalizing some of these changes? Do they have kind of like a DEI person? Do they have like staff that's kind of assigned to this? Is it just kind of collectively the leadership all says that it's going to be kind of a disseminated like institutional change, and we're going to make these kinds of strategic changes across the board, but there's no kind of like central person? Like I'm just kind of in your mind, Dr. Danek, I just want to pick your brain a little bit about what is the structure that's necessary there.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think there's no one. We've talked about this because a lot of the call for change would be like, oh, you need to appoint a chief diversity officer. But then there's others that have said, actually, that is not the best structure for this because it's siloing or indicating that one individual is going to carry the university on this journey when the issues that need to be addressed are so decentralized across the institution. I believe you all might even have a bit more, at least in certain aspects that that Dr. Haynes has put in place around, for example, equity advisors in the faculty hiring process. I don't know on the ground how that works, but I'm just going to say I believe that that having more assigned roles is important as a first step, but I think if it stops there, that it is limited. And I think there needs to be many more ways of creating accountability and hard metrics in every unit and every division of the campus. So I don't know if that's an answer. I think the answer is I'm not sure which structure is the best.
Okay, no, that's fair. Like I said, it's a consistent conversation that we've had, and that has been my concern. Is that I follow some folks in different universities that are kind of like these chief diversity officers, and many of them end up quitting because they're kind of like they kind of end up quitting because they're like, oh, I've given this mantle and no actual teeth, and I couldn't do anything, so there's no point in me continuing. So.
Yep. And I think that's probably by and large a lot of people's experience. And so, but I don't think there's many institutions, maybe up until I think people are getting much more serious because of the upheaval of the past year about that. So things may be changing, but I think that probably there's going to be much more accountability across the institution, and that needs to be the case. Having one individual, even one individual in a college it's just not, it's not going to do it. It's just, it can't be one person's responsibility. That said, I think Doug Haynes has done is an amazing leader at your institution. So you're really fortunate, I think, in that regard.
Yeah, I think it's just my last comment, which is why I think it's important for units like ours to do the Black Thriving Initiative. So, yeah.
So I'm sorry, perhaps you said.
Go ahead.
Sorry, perhaps you said this, and it was
there was a lot of. Introduce yourself.
Oh, I'm a faculty member in the Department of Medicine and the director for the Community Engagement Unit for the ICTS. So my question to you is, do you know of other materials or like a training program to support faculty in supporting their diverse graduate students? Because I often feel like, you know, until we change the faculty structure, like I am who I am. So, you know, the students are going to have to work with the faculty or here. What resources are there that help faculty be better mentors?
Yeah, I think so. There was one I highlighted. I have not been to that workshop, but I thought it would be helpful. And I think that Julie Passelt is really one of the leading scholars in some of these areas. So I think it was at the Inclusive Graduate Education. They host or they offer a series of workshops for faculty. That first aid toolkit also has some resources and modules, at least for helping people to understand issues around equitable student experience, which I think is relevant to the research. So I would point to those two areas as potentially helpful for faculty.
So Jennifer, let me leave you with a really tough question. So I think this is one of the toughest issues that academic institutions and the society has to face, period, right? And you know, the whole history of tests like GRE on the one hand came about because earlier on, 50, 60, 70 years ago, groups were excluded from various higher education. And those groups said, no, give us a fair test to see if we can get in. And that's why we took that. And then you pointed out so well that there is a learning curve for alternatives like a holistic approach, whereas the GRE or tests like those, at least superficially, are fairly simple. So how do we achieve this goal of, we have a scarce resource, which is getting into college or getting into medical school, anything like that. That's the scarce resource. And you have more people that want to do that than you have space for. And you have goals of, we want to produce the best, in the case of medicine, we want to produce the most competent physicians. And we believe that competency is now related to diversity, which I think is clear. But we've got those two things together, you know? So how do we replace a simple economical test like the GRE with, as you pointed out, the holistic approach, which we don't yet know whether it produces that combination of competence and diversity. And it seems to be, at least at the beginning, more expensive. So if we approach this, you know, sort of methodologically, the way Deming and Duran did, and I'm so glad you brought that quote up, you know, how do we begin to construct a selection procedure which is at the same time effective, but also feasible, economical, useful, and fair? So you have 3 minutes to answer that question. I'm just kidding.
Yeah, you know, I'll send you an article we did on strategies for leaders on holistic review. It was for the health professions, but this came up over and over and over again. And so we sort of broke out what are the things you could do immediately that don't require additional allocation of resources. It doesn't mean that you have to involve now 50 faculty in the review of applications and things like that. So I would say the most important thing you can do is to commit to having an evidence-based admission practice in your division, in the selection of your scholars or whatever you're doing. So you make that commitment to begin with, then you start the journey. And maybe there's areas that, you know, part of holistic review of admissions tackles various aspects of it. It begins with, for example, in health professions, broadening who's on your admissions committee, making sure that the folks that are evaluating individuals actually, and if a major goal is around diversity, actually have the lived experience and the perspective to evaluate students. It could be as simple as, you know, asking questions on essays, or developing an interview rubric, or other ways that, for example, allow you to mitigate bias. So I don't think there's any problem with institutions tackling it slowly and adopting one practice at a time. There's certainly nothing that's going to create harm by, for example, using rubrics or ensuring 2 readers, or others to evaluate, an applicant. So I think there's the biggest hurdle for folks is committing to starting the process and recognizing that the current admissions process is flawed or has serious concerns. And then recognizing, I think, that it's a long journey, because I really believe that if you start it and you think it's going to be an easy and you're just going to find 1, 2, 3, we're going to select it by whatever it might be, then you're actually liable to wind up doing what institutions are doing now and saying, sorry, that's the best we have, and this is just unfeasible, and going back. I think the second thing I'll say is that, and I believe actually that toolkit identifies some areas to get started that don't make it, a terrible process to begin. I do think the other piece, at least how it was in the health professions, is there's power in numbers. So I think that there's going to need to be a lot more work that makes the admission practices more transparent. And it makes it clear to applicants how they're being evaluated, and more collaboratives of universities that are working on these issues together. So if you're in your disciplinary societies or other areas where you're working in consortiums, I think that makes it, it's hard to just tackle this as one individual institution alone. So that is how it was, yeah.
No, I appreciate that. And I think a couple of points you made are really critical. The idea of assigning this task to an individual is not going to work. This is why what we're trying to do, at least in our small corner, is this issue of how we address the issue of diversity. And what I like the phrase at UCI, inclusion excellence, is it's got to be all of our issue. It's got to be every one of us who thinks about this, and not just have this simple solution. Well, Dr. So-and-so is in charge of that, because I don't think that's going to solve the problem. And tied very much to that, I think is a point that you also made about what's the culture of your institution for a more diverse, in our case, workforce around translational science. Do the students feel comfortable? Do they feel that they've got folks to talk to? And I for one, like to echo, Dara, I don't think that, we all can be mentors for all kinds of people. I firmly believe in that. Maybe that's my age showing. I don't think we have to limit it that, one race has to only mentor one other race. I think we can all do that, but we all have to pay attention to that. And we all have to learn how to be better mentors. I think that's really, really critical. And that we create a culture at our institution, at least, where, folks from a diverse background feel comfortable. They feel like this is their home. And that, even back in the day when I went to medical school, which was in 1733, the, UCSF said to us, we all want you to get through medical school, right? And they said, because we're spending too much money on each of you to fail, and I thought that was a really, really healthy approach. Any other comments or questions before we end our discussion? Well, Jennifer, thank you so much. This was very, very stimulating. And I know that you've been involved with UCI, and we'll try to keep you posted as we proceed. We've got an annual report. We promised everybody an annual report on our